Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Chad Lineweaver. I'm on the board of the Morristown Festival of Books, and I'm also the director of the Morristown and Morris Township Library. I want to welcome you all today to the Festival of Books at Home. And as many of you know, the festival began in 2014, and our idea was to bring book lovers and authors together in engaging conversations about a whole array of topics. And the nice thing is we've grown each year. We've had more attendees, more authors, and more great conversations, but we could not do this without all of your help and support, and certainly the support of the publishing community and also all of our fabulous sponsors. I just want to take 1 second to thank Morgan Stanley Private Wealth Management, the Community Foundation of New Jersey, Delta Dental, Investors Bank, Morris Arts, Red Hook Management and Investment Advisors, and also the William E. Simon Foundation for all of their generous support. Now, I know we missed getting together in person last October, but it's given us an opportunity to explore a virtual event, which allows us to gather a broader audience from across the world. The need for great literature and conversation is now more critical than ever, and this event is our third of 4 that we're hosting this weekend. We were thrilled to have Kristen Hanna and Nadadia Owusu yesterday, and we look forward to hearing from David Michaelis and V.E. Schwab today. Many of you may recognize our moderator, who's Bill Goldstein from NBC's Weekend Today. Bill is also a founding editor of the New York Times Books website. Particularly relevant for today, Bill is the curator of public programming at Roosevelt House, which is located in the townhouse on East 65th Street, where Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt lived from 1908 into their White House years. Just so you know, this will be a dynamic conversation, and I'm thrilled to pass things off to Bill. So Bill, you take it from here.
Well, thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here and there at the same time, in Morristown and sitting in my house. And I am so excited to be talking to David about his biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. I'm a huge admirer of his work. I've read his earlier books, but this is a superb book, and it does a wondrous thing in bringing all the many aspects of Eleanor Roosevelt's life together in one volume, which is a miracle in and of itself. So David, I welcome you here and thank you for doing this talk, and thank you also for inviting me to be in conversation with you. Given the earlier biographies of Eleanor Roosevelt that Blanche Wiesen-Cook wrote a 3-volume biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, Joseph Lash needed 2 volumes and then edited other volumes of her letters, things like that. I want you to talk about how were you able to conceive of this book and do it as a 1-volume biography. That's, as I say, miraculous enough. And we only have less than an hour in which to sum up this book. So just everything is getting smaller, smaller, smaller as Eleanor Roosevelt's life looms larger in our imagination. So just begin how you conceived this book and framed it in your mind against sort of what had been known about Eleanor and what needed to be known about Eleanor.
Absolutely, and thank you, Bill, for taking time from your busy world and schedule and writings of which I am an admirer. And World Broke in Two, a read that I found myself absolutely enmeshed in. It comes up actually in Eleanor, as we will find out maybe even in this hour. I think that it terrified me, and it also gave me some early sense of reality in thinking about Eleanor's life in a single volume, both because of what you just said. It was both necessary, but also utterly impossible. And it was necessary because I was a fan of Blanche. I am a fan of Blanche Wiesen-Cook's 3-volume biography. I actually had reviewed her 2nd volume for the New York Observer years ago in a rave, and very much felt she was on the right track. But what I felt was coming from Blanche's work was a monument, and yet people felt at the end, do I really know her? And I felt that what we needed in the 21st century, because I think of Blanche's portrait as I do of Joe Lash's, as I do of Doris Kearns Goodwin and several others, as very much of the 20th century Eleanor. And I thought there is absolutely room for a single volume that will make people feel they know her, that will rescue her a bit from the archives. And a word on that, just simply that one of my great attractions to Eleanor was that the papers that she had given to the FDR library, the presidential library at Hyde Park, which is a wonderful place to work, were all behind the scenes. And one day when the Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. reading room was being dismantled for remodeling, I got this glimpse of the cartons on the metal shelves and saw the cubic feet, the Everest scale of Eleanor's papers, and kind of, well, blanched a little. I mean, I literally went a little pale, and Bill, Clark was the supervisory archivist and saw me having this reaction and said, well, actually, David, that's why you're here. We really need this story, this world of Eleanor needs a selector at this point. And the FDR library, of course, has a museum shop. And if you go in there, you do have this sense, I want this story in a single volume. It of course became immediately obvious to me that I had made an insane choice, because not only had I thought foolishly, oh, I won't have to spend a great deal of time on FDR in terms of his papers and understanding him archivally, but also this is about Eleanor. So, but you can't, and FDR is an enormous, immense figure of the 20th century. And of course, the figure of Eleanor's life in both positive and negative, and in both heroic and anti-heroic. And so you can't avoid FDR. So, but you're not writing a dual biography either, but in a way you're researching one. And so there were all these different contending imperatives in Eleanor's life. I wanted it to be short so people could understand it. But as we know, her life begins in the Victorian era and stretches through the atomic age. And in between is every major event of the 20th century. I mean, just when you've gotten finished with the First World War and you're into the 20s and her emergence into politics, suddenly the Depression lands, and suddenly she's First Lady, and suddenly she's in love. And we haven't even gotten to the Second World War. And one day, my wife, Nancy, walked into the study and we were talking about the summer, or we had been talking about the summer. Now I was in about 7 years or so, or maybe longer, I can't remember. And she said something about what we were doing later in the summer. And she said, because you're finished with the war, meaning the Second World War. And I said, no, I'm in 1928. And her face blanched. Anyway, in other words, no matter how far I got with Eleanor ever, there was always another mountain range. It was standing on the Isthmus Peak and seeing how much further I had to go. And it was always like that. And I never left the garage feeling, the study there feeling that I had done even a remotely Eleanor-like day's work, because you're following a person who went everywhere and met everyone. And there's no way to ever get enough and get it right. And yet, as the years went on, there did seem to be the sense that a single volume telling might be possible if I could survive this. And when I did get to the end, Alice Mayhew pulled chapters out of me, kicking and screaming. And it was with Alice's help, actually, that the whole began to emerge. I used to write full drafts first. Had I done that with this, I would have been lost. But Alice kept pulling chapters out, and it did begin to start having a reality, much to my surprise and in a way horror, because you can never, of course, you are leaving so much out by making those radical choices. And yet at the same time, with a new century, and another subject maybe to talk about some more later, but with the emergence in 2017 of authoritarianism, of a new American fascism, of a new kind of anti-government sentiment running through not just the nation, but in the world, you really could see what Eleanor's contributions were. All of a sudden, she popped up like a pop-up character in a book. I mean, I suddenly saw her in relation to the world we were now living in what she had done about democracy, that gave me a whole new sense of purpose.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, the thing that you said in particular about having to research a dual biography, even though you're only writing, a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. But I wanted to say, I mean, my question was not suggesting any criticism of Blanche or Joseph Lash, because I interviewed Blanche Wiesen-Cook about her biography, and she told me the story how when she first began it was at Joe Lash's invitation, really, because of what he was aware had not he had not addressed in his own book. So it's inevitable that there will be other books, even when there are marvelous, biographies in the field already. So I was always very moved by his awareness and his suggestion to her that she do that. The other thing that you say about how the book becomes shaped, held by the editor, by your editor. You said nice things about my book, The World Broke in Two, but I would always say in interviews when I was first discussing it, that it was a triumph of editing over my digressive mind, because it really was just as you say. I mean, so to shape the life in your own mind and then to write it, and then the editor, or hopefully your editor, will help you shape it even further. And that's how the biography really emerges. It's interesting you say that the 20th century lives of Eleanor Roosevelt and a 21st century life, because you began working on this in 2001. So it really was
2009, actually.
I thought you found, it was the story I'm thinking of is when you were working on Charles Schulz, and you found in 2001 Eleanor Roosevelt's My Day column. So
yes, indeed, that's true. I did begin with glimmers while I was working on Schulz, because their syndicates were Eleanor's daily column had the same syndicate as Schulz's Peanuts, and I was in a basement, and there were these long galleys of columns, and I was freshly surprised by the quality of what she had done in those columns. But in 2009, when I began, Barack Obama was president. And that was a moment, an entirely different moment of seeing the book and seeing Eleanor. And I think really to your point, what we're really doing, all of us is we are in conversation with the previous biographers. And I think each biographer or biography of a figure like Eleanor gives the Eleanor that the time in some ways demands. And I think, for instance, Joe Lash's Eleanor, not in all senses, but in some ways was a feminist hero, was somewhat of Franklin's, not victim, but Franklin was had the upper hand in that book in a way, but Eleanor kept shining through, and we began to perceive how important she was to him because of Joe Lash. Joe Lash suffers an interesting thing, and I'm fascinated by the way you describe how he passed the baton on to Blanche Wiesencook, a scholar with a great deal of passion and understanding of Eleanor. Joe Lash, I think I perceive, suffered a great deal from having been Eleanor's friend. And I just mean suffered by the fact that he knew her so well that he, in a way, had to leave things out that are not necessarily enormously earth-shaking or important, but his portrait is by far a admiring but highly political and politicized portrait of her. Not that doesn't diminish it, but it's very particular to its time and to him. And I think of Doris Kearns Goodwin's portrait of Franklin Eleanor and the World War II wartime White House. I admire it actually, but I also think of it as the Babar and Celeste version, meaning it's the moment where we wanted a couple, this couple that seemed to have split apart romantically, but come back together to form the greatest partnership in American presidential history, possibly. And yet, at the same time, I don't think necessarily they were as in love in the full arc of their story. They certainly had deep respect for each other, and we can get into that. But there was in Doris's portrait a kind of feeling of that's how we wish it were. I'm not sure every single part of it was exactly that way, or at least I perceived it somewhat differently. So you keep adjusting these portraits and you keep seeing it differently. And the Eleanor, for instance, that I saw, partly because I spent a fair amount of time on her childhood in an attempt to understand her father's alcoholism and addiction, which always seemed to me to be somewhat skated over because no one seemed to be able to get a hold of it. And I really wanted to get a hold of it. And I felt that the result of it, it's the childhood from hell, both because of her mother and her father. And in very brief strokes, she loses her mother, who was very cold to her, and she loses her younger brother. She has two younger brothers and loses one of them, and then loses her father. Her mother to diphtheria, a horrible strangling disease. Her brother to a scarlet fever, diphtheria combination. younger brother, and then her father too. What was not just a tumble down into alcoholism in a sort of old-fashioned 1890s clubman sort of way, but a really public shaming. As Teddy Roosevelt, as Theodore Roosevelt's younger brother, he was brought into the daily columns and press, first the whispering sort of town topics, gossip columns, but then it was full front page, Elliot Roosevelt shamed, and the disgrace that he brought to his daughter, who carried forward from that moment, was a disgrace that made people always used to say about Eleanor, oh, she was so good, or she was kind of a goody-goody, or she tried so well. She wanted to be good because her father was so bad. And her form of goodness originally was to say he wasn't so bad. See, I am good. We are good. And so in a way she had a mission. It wasn't just goodness coming out of some simpering part of her character or school marmish goody two shoes. She genuinely had a mission, and her childhood left her utterly alone. And in that sense, she became, for me, a kind of the classic, we all know from Harry Potter and various other forms of literature that the orphan is one of the great heroes, because the orphan is an intermediary. The orphan goes between worlds. And one of the things immediately that you see in Eleanor's life, especially when she went as an orphan to live with her grandmother and her feckless but charming, wonderful aunts and uncles up the Hudson River, in a strange house up there called Oaklawn, and also in their New York, was that she went between the worlds of her aunts and uncles and the more real world of the city when they were thrown into jail or when they got into trouble in court. She was very much the original in her own family, both, she became literally a kind of family undertaker when horrible deaths occurred, but also she became somebody who had no playbook and no understanding of how to do any of this, but gradually understood that the adult world was going to keep demanding these things from her. And so she got stronger and stronger at doing them.
You quote Alice Roosevelt Longworth, of course, who is usually good for a quip of some kind in almost any circumstance, but she referred to Eleanor, at least at one point, related to the Franklin's service in the Wilson administration and Eleanor's being in Washington, as being very do-goody and virtuous, which is just one way of looking at Eleanor, even though she was, Alice was talking about one particular time in her life. But you do give a very good sense of this sense of obligation, of redemption, of purpose. And yet what I found, you quote a wonderful thing that she says. I guess it was late in life. She was on an Edward R. Murrow TV show, and she talks about her, I guess, religious, philosophy. She didn't seem like she was a particularly religious person, but she said, I think I am pretty much of a fatalist. You have to accept whatever comes, and the only important thing is that you meet it with courage and with the best that you have to give. And that, I think, speaks to the very point you're making about the difficult, Dickensian. That's a cliche, yeah. But it was a very, very difficult childhood that she had, and her life philosophy that really grows out of that. And she carried it through for the 79 years of her life.
Well, it's interesting. The key people, again, Joe Lash's book came out just at a time when the Lucy Mercer story had just emerged already in one previous book. And it was beginning, and it was the 70s, and people thought of FDR's affair with Lucy Mercer as being a defining moment in the Roosevelt story. It's not nearly, of course, as defining as polio, but also it's not nearly as defining as the way Eleanor redefined the role of First Lady. And that's what, when you think of her being a fatalist, when you think of her being someone who, like Lincoln, understood melancholy and understood how to transmute pain into purpose, you see, and even today when we think of First Ladies, they usually have a cause. It's bullying, or it's unfortunately, or it's literacy, better yet. Eleanor didn't do that. She was not a niche healer. She was a holistic healer. And she came at people and came at jobs and came at worlds holistically and saw them both as a expression of the individual. She always started her causes. She always responded to things by seeing in the pain or story or trouble of one person a place where she was going to be able to now take her place and do something about it. That's always how she came at things. And in a way, that's always the person who is, she was faithful, by the way. She did have a faith. She had a strong sense of, while she was younger, a strong sense of faith. But she, in her later life, lost that entirely by not feeling that doctrine and not feeling that a set of rules or a set of beliefs was going to be the answer. The answer was always going to start with a single person and work out and move out from there. I found that the Eleanor who began seeing her husband paralyzed was a completely different Eleanor than the Eleanor of a year later. And so this is, polio struck in 1921, and then she became something different in 1922. And this is back to your book and to The World That Broke in Two. It was she and Willa Cather, by the way, who wrote about that moment that you wrote about so beautifully, saying that the world broke in two around 1922. Eleanor, was a fairly competent, fairly good political wife, but very strong, more stress on the wife than on the political in 1921. The experience of first rescuing Franklin with Louis Howe from the storm of polio, almost like he lost faith. He lost so much in that few weeks at Campobello that it was almost as if she and Louis had reached over the edge of a little dinghy, that they were all lost at sea, and pulled back into the dinghy an utterly lifeless, naked form. That's how broken down Franklin Roosevelt was that month. And after the initial rescue, however, and after the sort of weird kabuki and stage managing of returning Franklin Roosevelt from this utter breakdown of, in every way, physical and spiritual, to being a sort of upright, puppet-like figure who was beaming out all this positivity and radiance to suggest to people that he would not be permanently affected, because his single purpose of life was to become president. And he never lost that. And Eleanor and Louis together, in never losing it, helped him there. He had always felt marked for greatness. Eleanor had always simply felt marked by the shame and disgrace. And I think that this was the turning point moment where she recognized that were he to become who he really was, he would have to do this now enormous transformation. And that it was both a recognition that she was not going to play a part in the day-to-day business of remaking Franklin Roosevelt, but that in remaking herself, she would now give a utterly new start to their entire life. And that's what she did in 1922. That was the year that she began making, for the first time, making public speeches. She never thought she would speak in public in her life. She'd been raised not to, even say a word in public. She began representing women in New York politics. She joined the women's division of the Democratic Party in the state and began going in an automobile, driving herself, going county to county to county. And she made two friends, Marion Dickerman and Nan Cook, who were already in politics, who were a couple, and who she both created a political partnership with, but had a kind of her first analysis or her first therapy was with these, or sort of group therapy almost, was with these two women who were forcing her to acknowledge that she had feelings about things and that she was angry. Eleanor had been raised in utter repression of anger, of emotion, of tears, of shame, of all these issues that today we deal with, but in her day she was not supposed to. And this was sort of her first awakening to what it would be like to be an adult, to have an adult relationship where you'd be responsible for your feelings and your statements, and you couldn't just withdraw into a sort of chilly, cold, sad self-pity, which is what she had learned as a child to do. And so she was remaking herself emotionally, remaking herself developmentally and becoming a politician for real. She's often criticized today, her politics are criticized as a whole as being sentimental or as being not practical. They would be, where Franklin's the real politician, she's still seen often now as somebody whose politics were based in old forms, in old tropes. I actually don't see that. I see her constantly remaking herself in new groups, in different worlds, and going between the ones that she already knows, and always taking not so much a politician or leader's role, but the intermediary. She's always the go-between, and in that way creates a stronger coalition, creates advancement on one level or another for a group that's falling behind, and is never quite out front, but always pushing, but is always out front on change itself.
I mean, she was very much, obviously she's a great individual herself, and yet when she talks about herself in her autobiography, and her missions, you know, the things that she took as her missions really were defined in a certain sense by her being Mrs. Franklin Roosevelt. And she takes that very seriously, that is who she is. I mean, the United Nations after Franklin Roosevelt's death, I mean, that she dedicates herself to, you know, fulfilling his vision for that. And yet, so it gets us back to that idea of the dual biography, yet it's a biography of one person, because I was very moved by something she says after he dies, that we were all people, I think she says, those of us who laid in his shadow. And yet she's in his shadow, and yet she is her own individual. That's something that you show you know, very clearly. And it's in a certain sense, as much of a potent political force as she becomes on her own, it is drawing strength from still being in the shadow of his political vision in a certain sense, even though she often pushes against it and pushes.
Yes, and very much so. And she wrote that her last night in the White House. That was April 19th, 1945, and Roosevelt had died 7 days earlier, and she was writing her last word, you know, last note to the night to Lorena Hickok. And I too, always felt very moved for that in the same way, partly for the reason that it's an acknowledgement of how much he mattered.
Yes.
Both to her and obviously to the country and the world, but that it personally, and she used to say, she said not used to, but she said once, she said, I always felt safe with Franklin in the White House. And partly because of where we've been the last 4 years, partly because where we've been even for the last, you know, month or so, to know that somebody is in charge in the White House of a certain worldview and a vision, it does make all the difference. And it's almost a spiritual a reminder, but in her case, she could have been so much more critical of Franklin Roosevelt. She could have been, I mean, people used to criticize her for bringing him enormous piles of you know, material at night to read, and things that a basket that was specifically designed for her to put things in that he would then read or look at, and that she would sort of nag or nudge him to please pick up on this. This is very important. You have to look at this. He both depended on that and resisted it. But I think she could have been so much more, you know, pounding on him about things that I felt her respect for him, as was his for her. And especially when it came to her column, which was a daily column. And for the first time, a first lady was writing out of her own opinions, out of her own, not strongly, but strongly held opinion. And she became more vocal, of course, later on. But she would ask him, am I overstepping a bound by, when I refer in tomorrow's paper to the following? And he would say, you know, no, you go ahead. And if people give me a hard time, I'll just tell them I can't control you. And there was a mutual give and take between them that I found very moving. And also there was a moment where her brother, she had one younger brother who had survived, and Hall, his name was, had an really interesting career. He was a very smart guy who graduated college in 1913 and went off to the Yukon and became an engineer. And he was smart as all get out, but he just kept holding himself back in one way or another. And alcoholism finally ended his life. He drank himself to death in Walter Reed Hospital, the Walter Reed Hospital. And Eleanor's, she was just beginning well, she had just gotten a job that she was about to start, and FDR's mother had died a month earlier, and she went down to the White House from Walter Reed, having just watched her brother, in this last throes of a terrible, terrible death, and went into the president's office and to let him know the sad news. And he said, come over. And they were not demonstrative, but he took her, and this is a man, with lifeless legs, and he takes his wife in his arm, in his arms, and holds her. And the older boy, their older son James, describes this moment, and you can feel the pain for all of them in this, but how important each was to the other, especially now that they both had just lost the family member that to each was the most important in certain ways. And then off Eleanor goes very next morning to start her job as the co-director of the Office of Civil Defense. Always on to the next, and here we go. We're going to save the country now.
One thing I just want to say, a bit of housekeeping, is we will be going to questions at about 2:45 or so. And so those in the audience who have questions, you should put them in the Q&A and we will get to them. I should have said that earlier, but have your questions prepared and put them in, and then we will get to them. But in speaking about Franklin, there's one thing that has haunted me for decades. I mean, in reading Eleanor Roosevelt's autobiography, is the thing she says very near the end about Franklin. She says, "I was one of those who served his purposes." And it seems to me so honest on the one hand, hiding so much. It's so incredibly forthright. I mean, when you think of a first lady writing that not too long after his death, it's one of these things that is totally honest and yet totally a veil at the same time. And I've always felt that, as her sense of herself was so clouded in one way and yet so certain in another.
Well, and Franklin had this ability, and had it since he had essentially been able to talk his mother into doing his business. He was always the charmer who was, and somewhat of a deceiver, in that he would get what he wanted, and he got it out of you too. And that was the sort of, I think she was feeling the lifetime pull of someone who had always gotten her to do as he wanted, even despite sometimes her own better judgment. But she was also delighted and so glad to be part of what his business was. And it's, she's the beta, he's the alpha, and there's always a bit of pain there. But I think it was, as you say, the honesty and forthrightness of the recognition that that's what the relationship was, and that's what so many of, and in a way it's a slight absolving of the others in the Roosevelt administration and world who also had been sacrificing their careers and their lives to serve this sun god. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt wasn't a Caesar. That was sort of the joke about him, because we now know what a Caesar looks like, what an American dictator might look like. Franklin wasn't an American dictator. He was just an absolute a sun god. I mean, he had everybody around him doing his business, and he had a conception of the presidency only as himself as president. That's what the presidency was. It wasn't anything else. It was Franklin Roosevelt. And it's quite extraordinary to see how he was able to manipulate people to do what he wanted to do, but also to remain, I think, in people's lives something real. He never, I don't think he ever became unreal to those around him. And Eleanor, I think, together they kept each other real in a certain kind of way, and they always had.
I mean, one thing I want to talk about, I mean, in terms of the White House, you have this marvelous, I mean, of course, we know now about her relationship with Lorena Hickok, and you write very wonderfully. It's kind of a rhetorical question almost, but then of course you answer it. You say, would any president's wife before or after Eleanor conduct a love affair during her husband's presidency? I mean, and we don't know. I mean, in many ways, I mean, so it's an open-ended question, but it's wonderful. The important thing you say was to handle it so well that no one would notice. She would not make it a challenge to Franklin, and she would never put a foot wrong in public. So can you talk about Eleanor, the private person, the private woman, particularly in that phase of her life, and how she negotiated her emotional attachments to Franklin, to other people, and also her public duties, because she never retreated from public life in the way that many first ladies have had to do, or they just stay in the residential part of the White House and make public appearances at less politically fraught events. But talk about Eleanor, just how distinctive she was in what she was doing and what she was negotiating.
I mean, the first thing to remember about her is that she's the niece of the hyperkinetic 26th president of the United States and the wife of the hyperdramatic 32nd president. So in other words, we have somebody, when she entered the White House and was by then, because of her having met Lorena Hickok on the campaign, fully in love and fully in a relationship now that had to remain secret. She was someone who both understood entirely how the White House worked on a political level and on a personal level as well. So she was prepared, but she also had, I think, and it's part of her development really, is that she always felt that to be in love or to love someone was to be useful to them. That to get somebody, to get love, to be loved was to find yourself in a relationship where you could do practical things and real things with somebody, for somebody, in a way serving them, but also taking back whatever you could from their, whatever they would give back if you gave to them. And that transaction was the key with Lorena Hickok. She was the first one and only, as Eleanor always called this sort of slot in her life, which was, there was always one person with whom she was closest, whom she was most intimate. It was sometimes a man, sometimes a woman. She was always in need of a, sort of a secret sharer almost, a Conradian kind of figure almost, who was right there with her, but invisible, and who was sometimes a kind of a double in a way of hers. Lorena is sort of a double, but not really. Anyhow, she had these very strong, very intense, intimate relationships. She'd had one earlier with her bodyguard, Earl Miller. Joe Lash, a young politician, radical politician, was another who she was soon to begin to be close with after she and Lorena Hickok began to wane. But so there was always a place in her life. And with, for instance, Earl Miller, I was sort of shocked to find that at one point in the relationship, he had a little house that she partly was paying for north of Albany. He was a bodyguard that FDR had when he was governor of New York, and then Eleanor took on, and he had been a New York State trooper, and so this was very much his part of the world. But that she would go and sort of spend afternoons sort of sweeping up and tidying up and doing laundry, and it was just her way of having a normal life, a little simulacrum of a real home, of a place that was hers. And she, of course, had created that at Valkill with her friends Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman. So she was always creating worlds in which they were somewhat artificial in the sense that they lasted only a short time, but they were very real. And I feel that what she did in the White House by bringing Lorena Hickok in as her one and only, meaning she put a photograph of Lorena Hickok next to her bed in the southwest corner in the room, in her bedroom, which was, there was a sitting room and a bedroom, and there next to the First Lady's bed is a photograph of an Associated Press reporter who covered the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, who covered, all the racy stories in Albany. She was a rough and tumble, incredibly glamorous character who I always thought Patricia Arquette would play a great Lorena Hickok in the way she did in Boardwalk Empire, a sort of similar character. So in other words, Eleanor and this wonderfully colorful, incredibly verbal woman who actually behind the scenes is teaching Eleanor how to be a better columnist, how to be a columnist, sorry. She was the one who helped Eleanor figure out how to have a column. And she was the one who taught Eleanor a lot about going out into the world and going out into the West Virginia hollers and going into communities where there was a great deal of pain and stress and turmoil because of the Depression and so forth. I mean, Lorena was a kind of, she was a teacher really, and she was a mentor in certain ways in terms of the column. There was no question about it that Eleanor was she was never going to shirk her duties as the White House hostess, as the mistress of the White House, so-called in those days. The First Lady was very much tied to the job of bringing people in. And Eleanor actually took pleasure in it and was extremely tolerant of things in it that you wouldn't have expected, giving her mother-in-law higher rank at the tables, at the state dinners, because the mother of the president, of course, has no rank, but Mrs. Sarah Roosevelt demanded that she sit as high as possible above the salt, as they used to say. And this was something Eleanor would have to kind of leave her place and give it to her mother-in-law. And she would see people occasionally stealing the silver. She'd see people slipping plates, the china into, and she always recognized people for who she took, I think the phrase these days is to meet somebody where they are. She met people where they were. She didn't judge. She was a very obviously dignified woman. She wouldn't say, come, I'd like to lunch with you. She'd say, I'd like to dine with you. She was there's the diction, the voice, her presentation, her manner, all seems very patrician. But what I love finding out about her was how utterly human she was in her relations to other people, and how she tolerated people and understood them for who they were. And actually there was an aunt of hers, a cousin really, a second cousin who lived near Morristown, as a matter of fact, out in Llewellyn, in South Orange, I believe it was, who was a hypochondriac. And she always made a point of visiting cousin Susie and making sure cousin Susie was not over the deep end with her hypochondria. And always she recognized and understood people's foibles and their weaknesses and loved them for them. And in that sense, she, I think, broadened from individuals, people in her life, to the world at large.
I mean, one thing, you mentioned her hypochondriacal cousin. It's a very moving last part of the book. I mean, tragic almost. I mean, that Eleanor Roosevelt was not perhaps a little bit more hypochondriacal than she was, because she took very poor care of her own health. And while her end is not sad in the sense that she was working really almost until the day she died, you do get the sense of her carelessness at the end in a way that might have prolonged her life if she had paid more attention to it. You made the point about 1922 and how she changed so much. Then her world changed, she changed. And it made me remember in a new context something that you quote her saying, I think to her daughter. I mean, I think it's writing in the 1950s, but it may not be to her daughter, but she would have turned 40 in 1922. She was born in 1882, the same year as Virginia Woolf, actually. And she says something about her energy or something. She says, well, basically after 40, we're all living on borrowed time, and you have to, use it as usefully as you possibly can. I mean, I realize using it usefully is not the best phrase, but that made me remember that line, because in a certain sense, when she changes at 40, she's probably not remembering that when she writes this, bromide, well, we're living on time, borrowed time after 40. And yet that is the way she seizes life in 1922 after Franklin's polio, to begin and become this new person that you have described.
And living very much, I think, from then on in the present, in a way, in a daily, almost Buddha-like now sense. I mean, she cared less for the past than any other figure I've ever been drawn to or written about, and in a way freed herself. I mean, she's so American in that way. It's almost like the Ben Franklin idea of the American as the transcender of class and of time. She really escapes time in a way that is very much of the period. The 20s were kind of an escape from time itself, or an inner sort of interstices of between the wars. But she really, everything about what she did, for instance, with the automobile, the way she used it it was one of her great happy places, was to get in the car, put the top down, and just leave, and to free herself constantly in ways that women just weren't doing that much of, although it was the 20s. So yes, we are in that period. But she was not by any means a person of the 20s. When some reporter in Albany asked her about jazz, she was sort of, oh yes, the young people listen to that. And she gave this sort of exactly the same response 40 years later when asked about rock and roll very early on. So, oh yes, so she was never of the moment that way. But what she kept doing was pushing herself both in the air. I mean, for the First Lady to be seen crossing the country in the spring of 1933, for a person to look up in a town in America and hear a plane overhead and think, well, Eleanor Roosevelt's on her way to the West Coast. If that can happen, then anything can happen. Maybe we will come back. Maybe it is 1927 again, and there's hope and optimism in the country. And she kept doing that kind of thing of pushing technology, using technology. She just being mobile. I mean, just sort of the sort of Otis elevator, kind of putting the first, making the First Lady go up was an innovation that her Aunt Edith, who had been First Lady with her Uncle Ted, with Theodore Roosevelt, it was a big news story when she left the White House just to go home for the summer. That was, wow, the First Lady was going to Oyster Bay. I mean, Eleanor's everywhereness, the way she began to bring the First Lady to little towns. I mean, you went to see the president, but Eleanor came to you. And she did that with the bonus marcher army when they came to complain and bitterly demand their payment that they had not gotten the first time around. And Eleanor was brought out to the Anacostia camp of these men who had been World War I veterans who had not been paid, and MacArthur had sicked the entire. Hoover had sicked MacArthur and an entire army unit on the first bonus marches. They had torched MacArthur, and the army had torched the camp the first time around. And here she was walking in at Louis Howe's urging, and she sort of had no way, she thought, to connect with these men. And she just began talking with the first 2 or 3 men she saw on the chow line. And then within minutes, they were singing songs that she remembered from her own experience with the army canteen in the First World War. She was connecting in a way that was very characteristic of how she did it later. And the newspapers the next morning were full of what had happened, with a quote from a vet saying, Hoover sent the army, Roosevelt sent his wife. And it was sort of what she did. She connected with people, and she was an observer in a way and a noticer of people, so that she got to know you very quickly. And it wasn't fake, it was real. She really wanted to know who you were, and she listened. And I think listening was her superpower. She really could hear what people were saying to her in ways that very rarely, I think, someone in her position in those days would do.
Well, just before we go to questions, I wanted to go back to something you said about Lorena Hickok, Patricia Arquette. We had Amy Bloom at Roosevelt House when we could do these things in person. And I guess Katie Couric bought the movie rights or TV rights to Amy Bloom's novel about Lorena and Eleanor's relationship. It's called White Houses. So you should tell Katie Couric your casting idea, because if they're still going to make that TV series, Patricia Arquette, you should get involved as a historical advisor. The other thing was, in having Amy Bloom at Roosevelt House, we realized in the scene that she describes is they meet. Lorena comes to interview Eleanor in 1928 after Franklin has been elected governor of New York, and they meet for the first time and have coffee or tea in Roosevelt House, in the house that becomes Roosevelt House, and it just felt so immediate that we were talking about it in the very place where they had met. But before we go to question, I just wanted to quote, because you used the word rare, about Eleanor Roosevelt, rarely rare, and you have two marvelous quotes. One from Jacqueline Kennedy, who writes a letter in 1962 to Eleanor Roosevelt, and she says, "You are something so rare and so good for all women of my age to have to emulate, a great lady." And what's remarkable to me about that is the use of the word rare. And then Martha Gellhorn, who was sort of a friend and a foe, a frenemy, I guess we might call it, also refers to it as something so rare that there's no name for it, in what Eleanor is. But I love the way Jacqueline Kennedy's note says, and something so good for all women of my age to have to emulate, like as in possessing to emulate, but also having to emulate, having to rise to the occasion, especially as a first lady, to emulate this great lady. And just the two ways in which that verb have are used there seem to encompass so much about Eleanor Roosevelt then and today. What the way you present her in your book is someone to emulate. I mean, not only for women to emulate, but
and also it's such a generous thing in a way for the then Mrs. Kennedy to say, because in a way there's no career as Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean, she's such a one of a kind, and it's sort of like saying there'd be a career as Napoleon. They'll never, there won't be another. And I think in a way that the pieces of Eleanor that first ladies today, from Mrs. Kennedy's time to through the previous first lady, because I don't think the last one took a single thing from Eleanor Roosevelt, not one thing, but that they each find ways to bring her forward. Mrs. Obama certainly mentioned her a lot, and I know the two Mrs. Bushes did, and Hillary Clinton, of course, was, I think, rather unfairly tagged with having been channeling Eleanor Roosevelt in the White House. I don't know what that exactly ever even meant. I mean, I think anybody in Hillary's position might well have channeled somebody like Eleanor, but it was a identification that was honest and not phony, I don't think. So I always love to see how that in making the position real, first ladies have continued to use pieces of Eleanor that are real, and parts of her legacy remain very strongly, I think, in that job or in that house.
Well, thank you for this. We're going to go to questions from the audience. And I can't say enough about how wonderful your book is, and that it's filled with interpretation of Eleanor's role. I love that you quote, that she left things unresolved, and that was one of the things that made writing the book difficult, was that she herself tended to leave things unresolved. Well, you resolve a lot of things for us in your image of her, but I also want to say that as great as it is in scale, you also focus so beautifully throughout on little images like Lorena Hickok's photograph on the bedside nightstand table, and that you see the large and the small in wonderful perspective. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Bill.
So to the audience, Austin, our fearless leader, will be reading the questions. So when you hear his voice, you will know that it is not David and not me, and not a ventriloquist reading these questions.
All right, well, we have a lot of questions. We won't have time to get to them all, but I'll try and pick out the ones that haven't already been answered. So Maureen asked, can you talk about how she championed the rights of African Americans and impacted change on that front?
Yes, and it was a very slow walking of civil rights if you look at the entire range of Eleanor Roosevelt's contributions to what became the movement of the 60s. Eleanor Roosevelt died in 1962, and you can begin to start tracing her influence on the moral arc of civil rights around 1934, 35. By 1936, Eleanor had begun to be recognized and identified in the way that she was welcoming African-American leaders to the White House, the way she was bringing issues into the public discussion. And by the 1936 election, she was quite well known and was actively, through her campaigning, bringing the African Americans of the Republican Party, of the old Republican Party, into the Democratic Party. And that the Roosevelt coalition of 1936, which became the FDR coalition, the biggest landslide, I think then in electoral history, was partly due to Eleanor having brought the party, the African Americans of the Party of Lincoln into the coalition. From 36 to 39, it gets a little slow and frustratingly slow. And you see Eleanor doing things like resigning from the Daughters of the American Revolution when that organization, a private organization, famously denied Marian Anderson the Constitution Hall as a place to give a concert, simply because she was Black. And there was no simple about it, actually. It was, of course, outright bigotry. They denied it. Eleanor could see clearly what was going on, and she wasn't going to stand for that. She herself resigned, and in resigning, it became a very public story, and she brought into the consciousness of a great number of people at that moment the fact that there was this kind of bigotry at work in the life of a world-class artist who should and deserve to be treated far, far better. And indeed, she helped with Ickes, the Secretary of the Interior, make sure that Marian Anderson gave her famous concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, where you then see Dr. King's speech 30 years later. Eleanor wasn't at that concert. As a matter of fact, it was Easter Sunday, and she was at home, as she probably and necessarily needed to be, because that's where the First Lady was with the president on Easter Sunday in 1939. It wasn't out of any lack of interest. She constantly brought into the White House, into President Roosevelt's, onto his schedule and into his office, the leaders of the NAACP as they began to address incredible injustices and in constant. It was the constant theme of the Southern wing of the Democratic Party and its hold on FDR, because FDR's New Deal legislation would not have succeeded without the Southern Democrats. And yet really important pieces of legislation like anti-lynching legislation could not proceed because of the lock of the Southern Party. So this conflict, this constant contention, was where Eleanor could push something forward a bit, whether it was the sleeping car porters who were coming with a march of 400,000 African-American men, and she slowed that down until FDR could actually do something or not. It was 2 steps forward, 4 steps back. And so until after the war, and in her role in the UN, but by then she had become a director of the NAACP, she could begin to bring issues to much greater notice and wider notice after the Roosevelt administration. And sometimes to good effect, and sometimes, again, leaving people, some of her closest friends who were in the struggle, greatly frustrated. So it's a slow, it's not the sort of, it's more like the beginning of the movie Gandhi. It's very, very slow work. It's not exactly glory. It's, there's just a lot of, and she herself was a realist politically and a pragmatist. And if she thought that people were going to be, if she thought there'd be violence, or if she thought people were going to be where the bigotry was going to spill over into violence, she would say, no, we shouldn't do that. Or I think we've got to slow this down. So it's a very mixed bag. On the other hand, she was revered and loved by many African-American leaders. I mean, Mary McLeod Bethune and she were very much working together on certain things. There's a series of books that accompanied the time I was working on Eleanor, that we see with each one now, with each new book about Eleanor and African-American rights, a greater and greater awareness of her place in this story, which I only could do some of, but it's a significant part of what she believed in, for sure.
Laurel asks, how do you keep all these reams of research organized to be able to access them effectively when writing? And did you do all of the research prior to writing, or were you writing alongside the entire time?
Well, I was actually just looking this morning when I was thinking about today. I was looking at something in one of my files, and I thought, oh my gosh, yeah, she loved pewter. And there's so many different things that you collect along the way that don't end up, of course, in your final portrait. But I kept things straight by an old method that I learned from Buckminster Fuller, of all people, to put every single thing that comes into the research in one long, huge chronological file. And then to, of course, break that file out into years and break it out into people and break it out into ideas. And so I had massive numbers. I think really for me, it was both the horror of it and the beauty of it was that I could find things suddenly, obviously from searching in ways that I never could before. But also it was that there was so much about Eleanor that I kind of at one point lost patience with my great chronological files and all my internet and computer files, and actually went back to color-coordinated 4x6 cards. Everything that Eleanor did was on a green card. Everything that Franklin did was on a blue card. Everything that Mama did was on a purple card. The children were yellow, and the Roosevelts of Oyster Bay were red, and the Roosevelts of Hyde Park were blue, et cetera, et cetera. And then I would begin to write chapters by taking the important cards from my massive card file and sort of shuffling them and beginning. I literally would do that sort of Hollywood thing of putting I would do step outlines with my cards on my bulletin board. I had to go back to a sort of more analog and tangible world because there was just too much in the machine, in the computer, that I finally couldn't really face it sometimes. Even there was so much in there. Whereas if it was in front of me and on the bulletin board and here, I could begin to focus, and I would go one card by card by card by card. That was my essential method, and also just endlessly rewriting outlines, which I never seemed to be able to find. And partly, as Bill was wisely mentioning earlier, the whole notion that you have is that life. Well, I mean, I don't think any of us really think our lives are going to resolve particularly into a completely meaningful whole. But you do suffer this illusion when you're writing a biography that there will be a meaningful whole, partly because in a way it demands it. A book is a meaningful instrument to make a whole. But I kept fighting with this, and it really wasn't until I let go of the idea that there would be a nice, neat, 4-act meaningful whole, and it just wasn't going to work that way. And when I finally let go of that's when I began, as well as the fact of the Trump presidency, which allowed me to see Eleanor politically in a very whole way. Those two things allowed me to finally write the book that I wrote.
And that leads brilliantly to our next question, which is from an anonymous attendee. Compared to today, how did the press treat Eleanor?
Interesting question. They were respectful. The press corps that she brought into the White House, partly that she initiated, where she created a women's press corps that had never existed within the White House before, by having weekly women-only press conferences. That created both a positive thing for the women who were reporting, giving them lead stories that they had never had before. But also they treated her very respectfully, and they would often say to her, you're saying far too much to us. You're being far too candid. Do you really mean that? Do you really? And she'd say, yes, of course, I said it. So, but the wider press and the world of bigotry, and the world of Southern politics, and the world of the Ku Klux Klan, and the world of America First treated her with as much hatred, I think, as we're seeing today. I mean, it was a surprise to me at first in the year 2009 through around 2015 to see the way Eleanor had been treated. I thought, are you kidding me? The way there's a famous story of Eleanor Clubs, which was a massive rumor that came out of nowhere, or in the South, that Eleanor Roosevelt was this is like a Q type conspiracy theory, that Eleanor was the force behind in each house in Southern towns and cities were African-American domestic workers who had given signals from Eleanor Roosevelt would do things with their cooking, or they would do things with, you know, in poisonings and other things that would do harm to their white employees. And that rumor just flew, and the FBI had to investigate it, and they came up with nothing in terms of that there actually being any such thing. You know, more rumors that there would be a day when African-American domestic workers and others would push old white people into the gutters of Southern towns, all at a signal from Eleanor Roosevelt. So there was as much hatred and one of the reasons Eleanor was hated was because she was so effective. She was so good at what she did, and she was so good at not letting criticism in any way touch her, in any way remove her or stop her, that it became, I think, probably a provocation to those who wished her harm and were against her to up the ante next time. So you see finally the Ku Klux Klan putting a bounty on her head at one point, where she's on her way to give a seminar, and she would not be stopped. You know, she was reluctant, but she kept a pistol in her car. She learned how to use it. She was taught how to, you know, sight down the barrel and point with the gun, and she could have done some damage if she'd had to. She never took it out of the glove compartment for anything but target practice. But in every sense, Eleanor was the sort of model of sticks and stones will break my bones. I mean, she just wouldn't let it get to her, and it wasn't that shit didn't hurt her. I think she actually felt quite hurt, especially by smarter people who she felt should not have been attacking her or her husband, but she just knew it was part of the deal. And when literal assassins, and there was more than one, when after Franklin Roosevelt, there was at least 2 times where his life was threatened. She just, you know, this was again the niece of the man who, Theodore Roosevelt, when he took a bullet in the chest through his speech in eyeglasses case at a Milwaukee rally, kept giving his speech. And she took these kinds of things in public life as part of the job. And she was kind of a pro that way. She was a sort of lifelong pro of what it meant to be out in public. And she could dish out some stuff. She dished it out to her cousin, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. during a 1924 race for governor, where she kind of, you know, really lambasted him for the Teapot Dome scandal by creating a paper mache teapot on a car that she would drive in with her other women political friends into rallies where he had just been, and puffing out steam, you know, the Republican hot air, and she'd get up and give speeches that really smeared her own cousin. So she was no saint about politics and the mud that was slung, and actually later came to regret that particular episode because she felt she'd gone too far. And actually there was a little moment just after that. This Teapot Dome was literally this enormous thing on the front of an automobile. And Lucy Mercer, the affair and scandal, fairly private by comparison, of Lucy Mercer had happened in 1918. This was now 1924. In the meantime, Franklin had gotten polio in 1921. And had he not gotten polio in 21, he who had run for vice president with Cox in 1920 would no doubt have been the leading presidential candidate in 1924. And so when Eleanor in 1924 smeared her cousin with this maneuver in the governor's race in New York, cousin Alice said afterwards, well, I'd like to see Lucy Mercer on the front of a car as a hood ornament in the next go around, suggesting that had Franklin been in the race, had he been in the fray, you know, you would have heard about that. He would have been tarred with this, with the brush of Lucy Mercer, and it was a mark again of their good luck, but Franklin's good luck, but that he was on the sidelines at that moment.
David, Bill, thank you so much for joining us. This was incredible to listen to both of you.
Thank you.
We are out of time, unfortunately, so we have quite a few more questions. I'm sure that people will be able to find you, David, elsewhere to ask them with their book groups or something like that.
DavidMichaelis.com.
Sorry, say that one more time.
DavidMichaelis.com has my email on it.
All right, fantastic. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Good luck with Larry Kramer. I'm so excited about that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Well, I hope everyone enjoyed the conversation this afternoon. The Morristown Festival of Books still has one more talk this weekend, V.E. Schwab at 3:30. We are currently at capacity for that talk, but we'll do our best to get everyone waitlisted into the event. But keep in mind that will be recorded and links will be sent out to everyone after that event as well. Please support our authors by buying their books at the official bookseller Bookends, and it's linked on our website. You'll all be receiving an email for this talk that we just had recorded, and allow you to revisit that engaging conversation as well. On behalf of the Morristown Festival of Books, we definitely want to thank Morgan Stanley Private Wealth Management, the Community Foundation of New Jersey, Delta Dental, Investors Bank, Morris Arts, Red Hook Management Investment Advisors, and the William E. Simon Foundation for their festival sponsorship. Thanks again, everybody. Make sure to save the date for the Fall Festival, October 8th and 9th, 2021. Have a great afternoon.